Hi, this is the second video, part 2, on the bite-sized snippet of science looking at the link between hearing loss and dementia. If you didn't watch the first video, you don't have to, but it might be an idea to go back and watch that first before continuing on with this video. And in that first video, as you'll remember, I really just described how hearing changes with age. And how we measure and test our hearing. And now in this video, we're going to start tying together hearing and cognition and looking at how they may be interconnected. Now, of course, if your hearing starts declining from around midlife to the point where around 1/3 of adults in their 50s have a mild degree of hearing loss, you can imagine that people live with hearing difficulties for a long, long time. Okay. Its impacts can be quite disabling, not just in terms of presenting challenges for communication, but as you would have experienced in the exercise we did earlier when you closed your eyes. Hearing is really important for your spatial awareness and for your mobility. It's been linked with things like increased risk of falls, for example. So it can be quite a strong contributor to what we call disability burden. And that is what you see here. Here is some data that is presented from 2009, so getting on now, but still good information from the World Alzheimer's Report from Alzheimer's Disease International. And what they do here with these sorts of measures is they look at a range of diseases and chronic conditions, and first look at how they contribute to things like premature mortality. They call that years of life lost. So those diseases that cause people to die sooner than they otherwise would have had they not had that disease. And that's presented in the pie chart on the right. And then there is another component to disease burden, and that is the years of life lived with disability. So this is the non-fatal component of disability burden. And these are the things that reduce people's quality of life without really reducing their length of life. And what you will see, and that's presented in the figure 2.1 on the left. And what you see is deafness features here on this slide. You could just think of this more generally as hearing loss. And it is a large contributor to the years of life lived with disability. So it has some quite disabling impacts, potentially if untreated or unmanaged. But if we look on the figure on the right, it has no contribution to years of life lost. And to start drawing the connection between hearing loss and dementia. You can see dementia is obviously presented on this chart too, and it has a similar sort of profile. So dementia is a large contributor to the years lived with disability, but only a very small contributor to that premature mortality or the years of life lost due to chronic disease. Okay, so we've shown how hearing declines with age across the life course. I've shown that older adults can potentially be living with hearing loss for a number of decades, and it is one of the greatest contributors to later life disability with a similar sort of profile to dementia. And in this slide, what I'm now showing is there is a strong co-occurrence between hearing loss and dementia. So if we were to look within the population of people who have been diagnosed with a dementia, and list their top 20 most common chronic health conditions that they have. And this is Australian data here. What you find is hearing loss ranks at about number 3. So it is around the 3rd most common chronic health condition experienced by people with dementia. So a little bit more than 1/3 of people with dementia will also have hearing difficulties. So there is an association there. But the question is how do we understand that association? And increasingly, it's beginning to look like, and people are accepting, that hearing loss often precedes dementia and is predictive of future dementia risk. In fact, hearing loss is now widely recognised as among the potentially modifiable risk factors for dementia. What I have shown here is a figure that I've lifted from an article published this year in The Lancet, so one of the major medical journals of the world. This article is actually open access, so freely available. It is written for a scientific or a clinical audience, but if you are so inclined, you're welcome to go and hunt it down and read through the paper itself, and you'll find this figure. And what this figure does is it shows different risk factors for dementia for different stages of the life course: early life, midlife, and late life. And what this figure shows is when you synthesize the evidence and crunch the numbers across a large number of studies to generate a population attributable risk, what they find is hearing loss has the largest attributable risk for dementia of midlife, and indeed of any risk factor from any time in life. So if we zero in on the midlife risk factors, we see that hearing loss has an 8% attributable risk. And one interpretation of this figure is that if you were to remove all the hearing loss in the population, you would reduce the prevalence of dementia by 8%. Now that is an optimistic upper threshold of what this number represents. This is a larger estimate than the estimates for other really well recognised risk factors for dementia, including hypertension, excessive alcohol consumption, physical inactivity. And the other takeaway from this slide is interesting. If we look at the late life risk factors for dementia, we can see that 3 of them can actually result themselves from hearing loss, and they are depression, social isolation, and physical inactivity. And this is worth bearing in mind because we're going to come back to this, because this is allowing us to draw a bit of a causal chain between hearing loss and dementia, where we can start to say, well, if people have difficulties with their hearing, then they're also at risk of having poorer mental health, experiencing loneliness, and lower levels of engagement in activities that we think are good for brain health. And so if we can treat the hearing loss, then we can prevent these downstream effects of hearing loss that are also risk factors for dementia. So there is actually quite a vast literature now, quite a large number of studies that have looked at the association between age-related hearing loss and cognition. They go back several decades, certainly to the 1990s, but there's also a handful of studies from the 60s, 70s and 80s as well, where they show a correlation between hearing and cognition. Initially, most of these studies were cross-sectional, so that means they were taken at a single snapshot in time and simply compare people with good hearing against those with poor hearing and look at their performance on a battery of cognitive tests. And we see that those with poorer hearing perform more poorly on these cognitive tests, even after we account for differences in other factors like age, health, and lifestyle. There are also a number of studies that have been longitudinal, so following the same individuals over time, over many, many years. And what those studies often show is those individuals with the poorer hearing are observed to have faster rates of decline in cognitive functioning. And again, that is after statistically controlling for other confounding factors like age, health, and lifestyle. There are also a small number of studies looking at hearing and volume size of certain brain structures, and we can see in those studies that that the poorer hearing is associated with smaller brain structures, usually in the temporal lobes, but some structures involved in memory formation, such as the hippocampus. And finally, there are a small number of studies that have looked at the link between hearing and the incidence of a dementia diagnosis. So the distinction here is those first few studies I spoke about, we're looking at performance on a battery of cognitive tests, so tests of things like memory, for example. But what I'm talking about here is an actual diagnosis of dementia. And the way these studies work is you take a population of, or a sample of individuals who are cognitively healthy, they do not have dementia, and you divide them into two groups, those with a mild degree of hearing loss and those without hearing loss. And then you follow them for up to 5 to 10 years. And what we usually find is within that group of people with hearing loss, there is a larger proportion of dementia diagnoses 10 years later than the group without hearing loss. And so that allows us to say that hearing is associated with an increased risk of dementia incidence. And the final interesting part about this is some studies have then looked at, well, are those people with a hearing loss who use a hearing aid, are they also at increased risk of dementia or not? And what they sometimes find is that if you have a hearing loss but are using a hearing aid, then it looks like you're not at increased risk of dementia. So overall, some very promising research drawing a connection between hearing and poorer cognitive functioning, smaller brain structures, and increased risk of dementia incidence, and a handful of studies suggesting that using a hearing aid may protect against this poorer cognition and protect against this diagnosis of dementia. So the question becomes, why? Why do we expect to find a strong relationship between hearing and dementia? And there's really three broad types of explanations, all of them likely. The first one is a biological explanation. This was sort of the dominant theory in the 1990s especially, known as the common cause hypothesis. And this was really just saying, well, there is a common neurobiological mechanism that drives both, that is causes both poor hearing and poor cognitive functioning, and we just don't know what that is yet. A second explanation is cognitive load. So you would probably understand this as something like effortful listening. So when you're trying to listen to a conversation in a crowded restaurant or at a cocktail party, for example, and it's really hard over the background noise to understand and follow along in the conversation. And so the communication difficulties we have as a result of the hearing loss cause a cognitive load, and we use more cognitive resources to process very basic information. And that means we don't really have the cognitive processes available at that time to engage in deeper thinking. And then the final explanation we can think of is what some people call psychosocial mediation. And this is really the pathway that I've referred to earlier. It's kind of like a cascade model where you can think of changes in the inner ear causing hearing decline, communication difficulties. Now, communication difficulties cause, well, they're embarrassing, it's frustrating, and as a result of that embarrassment and frustration of the communication difficulties, well, we just stop doing a lot of the things that are good for brain health and possibly things that we enjoy doing. So we reduce our levels of activity engagement, and that has impacts for our mental health. We become lonely and we withdraw socially, and all these things in combination impact on our cognition and on our brain health, and that puts us at increased risk of dementia. And these last two explanations, particularly the psychosocial mediation explanation, are key because they suggest that we have here an intervention target. If we manage our hearing, we can reduce these downstream effects, these knock-on effects of poor hearing, and therefore reduce the risk of dementia. Now, I've lifted this quote from the website of a hearing aid manufacturer, and I've lifted it because I think it summarises really quite nicely the idea here. So the quote is, by helping to at least partially restore communication abilities, hearing aids may help to improve mood, increase social interactions, and enable more participation in cognitively stimulating activities, and consequently could slow cognitive decline. Now, this is important because it's couched in terms of something that might happen or that could happen. So, and this is an important thing to recognise. We don't actually have strong evidence that hearing loss is a modifiable risk factor. We think we have good evidence that it is a risk marker, so perhaps an early signal that of something that may happen in the future in terms of our cognitive outcomes, but we don't have good evidence that using a hearing aid has cognitive benefits. And this is really important take-home message here. There are lots of other really strong, well-documented benefits of using a hearing aid, but dementia prevention is not yet one of those things that I think we can add to the list. It's nearly there, but not quite. So if I could just to conclude here with my final slide, we do think we have good reason for believing that hearing loss with age is tied to cognitive decline and dementia. We don't know if it is a modifiable risk factor, and we still need some good research to tease out these causal pathways. The etiology still needs further clarification. So this is an active area of research. There are a number of studies now using more fancy statistical models, trying to model that cascading causal pathway between hearing loss and cognitive decline, and they will produce some interesting results, I think. But what most of us are watching are a couple of large randomised control trials. So these are clinical trials where giving randomly people hearing aids and the very best of hearing healthcare. They'll be compared to a control group, and they'll be followed for a number of years, and we'll compare the rates of dementia within those who are getting the best of hearing healthcare against those in the control group. And these sorts of randomised designs will give the best evidence that we can get to support the idea that hearing is a modifiable risk factor and a new target for dementia prevention interventions. And one final thing I really should do is just to give some acknowledgement to the bodies who have supported my research in this area over the last several years, and so they are the Australian National Health and Medical Research Council and also Dementia Australia, who are currently supporting a study I'm conducting called the Auditory Ageing and Cognitive Impairment Study, or Audacious as we like to call it. There's a link to the Audacious study website here on this slide if you would like to find out more about this research.